passwordless authentication. As Vic mentioned, I'm Joe Skosich, Vice President, Global Sales and Marketing at Identity. Now, for many of us, 2021 couldn't come fast enough. You know, the world is very different than it was a year ago. But one thing that hasn't changed much is the way that we authenticate. Now, having said that, for the next half hour, I want you to imagine a world without passwords. Now, we use passwords several times a day, but few of us have ever thought about why we should not use them or how that would even be possible to go passwordless. And I realize that most of you are auditors, but many of you do have influence over technology choices. And I hope you'll come away with a different mindset when you decide on future authentication solutions. Now, I founded Identity over a year ago, along with a team of experts that share this passion for doing things right. And we believe at our core that authentication should be simple and secure for everyone, and it should be without passwords. So what do we have on tap today? Well, before diving into best practices for passwordless authentication, I want to start the discussion on the importance of the user experience and how passwords have actually become a liability to your organization. Now, after that, I'm going to share some key capabilities that are necessary in order to make passwordless authentication simple and secure. I will also offer some tips on how an organization can transition to passwordless authentication with minimal friction. And for your reference, a copy of this presentation will be made available after today's session. Now, included in your copy of the presentation will also be a link to a YouTube video playlist of some passwordless authentication use cases that you can view later. And we're going to end today's presentation with some Q&A. And we'll be using the chat window to field any questions that you may have. Just make sure that your chat is directed to the panelists and attendees so everybody can see the questions. And by all means, as a question comes to mind, please go ahead and post it in the window before you forget. Now for those history buffs out there. You know, Fernando Corbato invented the password in 1960. Can you believe that with all the rapid advances in technology, we're still primarily using something that's 60 years old? And before his passing last year, he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and he says, unfortunately, it's become kind of a nightmare with the World Wide Web. I don't think anyone can possibly remember all the passwords that are issued or set up. That leaves people with two choices. Either you maintain a crib sheet, a mild no-no, or you use some sort of program as a password manager. Either one is a nuisance. Well, there actually is a third choice, and that's drop the password. And that's what we're here to discuss today. But first, I think we need to look at why the password is such a problem. Now, let's begin with something everyone will agree on. Users don't like passwords. You know, according to one study, the average user has more than 191 passwords to remember. Now, I only have around 50 to 60, but even one is one too many. How many passwords do you have? Do you favor long random strings or longer simple passphrases? To make things more secure, would you rather implement an authentication policy that uses the same 30-character password or execute 3 simple factors of authentication without a password for every site? You know, the famous psychologist George Miller, his lifelong study of the human cognitive science found that the typical person can remember up to 7 digits, and people with exceptional memories can remember 9. Now, this doesn't include letters or characters. You know, my mother-in-law has this nice book next to her computer so that she and any unwanted visitors in her house can easily look up a site's password. Now, if you make your passwords longer and require characters and letters, they become even more difficult to remember. And 73% of respondents to a recent study consider forgetting the password the most frustrating aspect of account security. And there are many products whose main job is just to keep track of your many passwords. But users have to learn how to use these products, and in many cases, they have to pay for them. Now, some studies show that stringent password rules lower an organization's risk of breaches when compared to using more simple passwords. Now, I really question that study because stronger passwords actually introduce friction, and users will find ways to reduce that friction, probably by placing a sticky note with a password under the keyboard or worse, right on the monitor for everyone to see. And many times, the password policies aren't even presented to the user during registration. So the user is forced into this trial and error to get a password that works. Now, my wife, God-fearing, animal-loving woman whom everyone likes when they meet her, but you ask her to create a password and she is swearing like a drunken sailor. Now, whether you choose a long, complex string of characters or longer, simple passphrases, strong passwords are difficult to create. Let's not forget that it's not only recalling the password, but it's also the difficulty in typing them in consistently, especially on mobile devices. Yeah, there are password managers, and Apple has the keychain, but you still have to type it correctly at least twice during registration. Well, it's clear why chief digital officers and chief marketing officers are laser focused on the user experience. Contributing to this, did you know that 1/3 of all shopping carts are abandoned due to forgotten passwords? And bad user experiences causing health insurers to lose revenue. You see, if a user is looking for health insurance and they have a bad experience, they're going to go elsewhere to buy. Now, according to the Kaiser Fund survey, this equates to when you look at the average premium for single coverage at $6,400 a year, and the average premium for family coverage is 18 grand a year, just 50 to 100 customers could account for $1 million won or lost. And people want systems that meet their needs, are easy and pleasant to use, and that are well made. This ease of use and design quality have become selling points for companies like Apple, Amazon, Intuit, and others. And the results of these improvements are impressive. When you look at, take Bank of America, for example, they redesigned their registration process and were able to improve and increase their registration by 45%. American Eagle Outfitters increased their sales by 53% after they redesigned their website. Clothing retailer Anthropologie increased their sales by 24% with a user UX redesign that made their checkout process much easier. Now get this, Microsoft, they did some research on their search engine Bing, and they found that the link color didn't project a feeling of confidence. So they changed the color to a bolder blue. And they estimated that this generated an additional 80 million in advertising revenue, just a shade of blue. Now, is there a particular site that you've encountered that wins that worst user experience award? Well, I'm sure that some come to mind quickly. You see, this UX and user experience is a $1 trillion problem. And think about this, registration and authentication is the first thing a user sees. So it's going to have a huge impact on that. Now, during the pandemic, much of the world has been under this stay-at-home directive. And there were brief shortages of popular items. We know what they were. Now, this really pushed a lot of consumers to online shopping for the first time. In fact, we saw online sales increase 55% in July of last year compared to the year before. Digital banking has been soaring during this pandemic. And as of April of last year, the digital banking usage among the larger banks had actually increased to 72%. Delivery services for food and other items have increased. Apptopia's data shows new records for Instacart, Walmart Grocery, ShipT, and Target. All have seen triple-digit increases in growth. State and local websites, they're seeing a lot more traffic in lieu of in-person visits. There were over 5 billion website visits in the past 90 days. And more patients are interacting with patient portals, and CMS has actually granted payment parity between telehealth and in-person clinical care, and that spurred even more patient portal activity. Telemedicine like eCare21 is just booming. In fact, a report by Frost & Sullivan estimates that telemedicine services are going to grow 7-fold by 2025. And of course, remote learning has increased. Globally, we still have about 1.2 billion kids that are out of the classroom. And the overall market for online education is projected to reach 350 billion by 2025. Now, some research suggests that online learning and all of the shopping activities and the increase in online activity is actually here to stay, because a lot of the consumers have found that maybe doing it the first time wasn't as hard as they thought it would be, and the experience was much better than they expected. So a lot of them are probably going to stay. Now, when you look at the headlines, once every few days, there is a major brand in the news addressing some data breach. Now, 80% of the data breaches involve stolen passwords. And studies are now showing the financial impact long after the actual breach. 31% of consumers surveyed say they discontinued their relationship with the company that had a data breach. And of those consumers that were affected by one or more breaches, 65% say they lost trust in the breach organization altogether. We've seen stock prices drop an average of 5% when the data breach is disclosed. And 71% of CMOs believe that the biggest cost of a security incident is actually the loss of brand value. Now to set the stage for the attack surface at work. Did you know that 1/3 of workers don't care about their password? Now that makes securing the enterprise even tougher. And 53% of workers use the same password for work and home. Think about that. 53% of workers using the same password for work at home. This is the scariest aspect for me. Home networks, we know, don't have the sophisticated IDPs and firewalls like you do in the office. And IT departments just haven't had the funding to employ tools that are going to mandate stronger security. But the business must stay open. So with workers at home, how are they connecting to the enterprise? Well, almost all of it is usually through a VPN or a remote desktop protocol. Each have their own issues with deployment and vulnerabilities. And with the increase in VPN usage, password resets are on the rise. A joint US DHS CISA and UK National Cybersecurity Center alert outlined one method called phishing with a V. You see, hackers know that reset VPN passwords are delivered via voicemail, so they've launched phishing attacks to steal them right from the PBXs. And RDP has its own set of vulnerabilities. Brute force hacking, running username password crackers is a problem, and many of the RDP passwords are actually already sold on the dark web. Now, having said that, COVID-related cyber attacks, particularly social engineering, are on the rise. Now, here's some common techniques. Usually you'll find hackers posing as a fellow employee, uh, as an employee of a vendor or partner company or auditor, as a new employee requesting help, pretending to be from a remote office and asking for email access locally. They pretend to be someone in authority, or as a system manufacturer offering a system update or patch. Now, all of these schemes have exponentially added to the cybersecurity risk. And many studies are indicating that many of those that have moved to work from home are likely there to stay. You see, there's going to be future pandemics and local outbreaks. And this is actually going to keep companies thinking about keeping as many working remotely as possible. But at the end of the day, remember this: the IT security professional has to be right 100% of the time. But a hacker, well, they only have to be right once. Now, while consumers have changed their behavior because of COVID, there's been a big spike in cyber threats to users at work and home. You see, hackers often use current world events to make their scams more effective. And cyber criminals have launched several campaigns that have been identified by cybersecurity companies. And these cyber criminals are attempting to exploit concerns of things like COVID-19 outbreak for their own criminal end. Now, worse yet, cyber criminals have actually targeted the supply chain and delivery of the vaccines that have been rolling out. Now, this was uncovered by IBM cybersecurity researchers, and the researchers concluded in their report that employees in the supply chain were phished for their credentials, which are going to be used later to gain access to confidential data. And Google recently disclosed that it's been identifying more than 240 million COVID-related spam messages per day, and that it had detected 18 million phishing and malware emails a day related to the pandemic. And overall, Gmail blocks more than 100 million phishing emails daily. Now, some common COVID scams and phishing techniques include tricking consumers into clicking malicious links using tax relief and government-issued stimulus plans, tricking consumers to download documents labeled as COVID safety precautions. They're duping consumers to click links and emails offering an updated list of new COVID cases in the local area. There are phishing attacks soliciting donations to fight the spread of the coronavirus by imitating organizations like the CDC and Red Cross. We see fraudulent e-commerce for masks, sanitizers, and test kits. And not a direct scam, but it's related. We see a massive increase in the coronavirus themed domain registrations that are going to be used for later phishing attempts. And then there is the recent state-sponsored breach that some are calling the breach of the century due to its scope and magnitude. This, of course, is the SolarWinds breach. Now, this started with the breach of a password to a system that pushes updates to millions of servers, including those at Microsoft. The password to this system, SolarWinds123. Now, I'm sure many of you watched the hearings on C-SPAN, grilling the SolarWinds executives on, how such a simple password could be used for such a critical infrastructure system. And of course, the executives were quick to pass it off to an intern. But really, think about it. What if we were not using passwords for authentication? What if there were at least 3 factors of authentication without a password that were not vulnerable to impersonation? So it's clear, passwords have to go, but many of the current solutions out there are cumbersome. And users aren't going to buy in if the process is difficult or time consuming. And businesses generally aren't going to invest in a solution that frustrates their customers or their workers. But unfortunately, hackers aren't going anywhere. So businesses are left juggling customer satisfaction or security. And what we have today isn't simple or cost effective either. But we can't sacrifice security for ease of use. So to drive adoption, a solution has to be simple and secure. Now, I know for many years, the thought process has been that simple and secure have an inverse relationship, meaning the easier it is for the user, the less secure the solution becomes, or the more secure you make it, the harder it is for the user. But that's not the case. Let's look at some key capabilities that a passwordless authentication tool should have. Now, the primary authentication method should use something that 3.3 billion of us already have in our hands, our smartphone. There's so much computing power in our mobile devices, and most come with built-in biometrics, and that actually adds another factor of authentication. There should also be alternate methods, such as using other devices like our PC or Mac, but for the most part, users are going to be comfortable doing everything on their mobile device. The goal is to eliminate the password, but we need to make sure it's simple and secure. Now, whether you're a consumer or worker, registering should be simple. For consumers, having the option of tapping a social identity icon eliminates typing a username. And the social identity API shouldn't just ask for an OAuth token, just the attribute that uniquely identifies the user, like an email, that eliminates the typing process. Now, employees will typically authenticate using their intranet credentials or their username that they're used to, and this validates their identity. Now, you should also make use of QR codes during the registration process. QR codes should take them directly to whatever app needs to be installed. You don't want to send them to an app store and have them search for it. My mother-in-law tries this, and trust me, she will install the first app she sees. Well, you've broken the process. Now, once you've registered the user, go ahead and log them in. Don't make them run through the gauntlet again. I see this time and time again with a lot of registration processes. Listen, you will never be as sure as you are that that user is that user during registration. Why not just log them in? Now, privacy. You've got all kinds of privacy considerations. So first and foremost, during the registration process, avoid collecting any unnecessary personally identifiable information on consumers. And at a minimum, you really only need a username to register and bind an account. But you need to offer the ability to request additional fields if necessary. And ultimately, allow the user to choose what is saved and what is not. You need to also allow them to change that username. How many places have you logged into where once you've created your username, that's it? You can't go back and change it. That is frustrating to users. Now, while you're eliminating the passwords, you should probably also think about eliminating remembering usernames. The Authentication app should keep a list if it allows multiple sites and multiple authentications to keep track of those usernames. Now, you also need the ability to back up credentials because think about it, people are going to lose their phones, they're going to upgrade their phones. So you need the ability to back up those credentials to something that can be ported across both of the major platforms that are out there in the mobile world, Apple and Android. Now, with registration and self-care covered, what about authentication? Well, again, core tenet, you need to keep it simple. Now, users should be able to just accept or deny with a single gesture to perform multi-factor authentication. Now, this increases usability and security. And by the way, make use of the device biometric. It's pretty good, and it's something that the user is already conditioned for, right? So, if the user has an iPhone, they're likely used to facial recognition. If users have some of the older Samsung devices, they may be used to fingerprint. Let them choose what is most comfortable for them. And instead of forcing these users to remember and frantically type down digits as the clock ticks down, think SMS OTP, use comparison for just a single glance assurance. Because when you use comparison to authenticate, it's faster and it's less error prone. So what should you be comparing? Well, the authenticating server should send something that lets the user and the authenticator app know that it's coming from a legitimate server, eliminating fake website and man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, some companies are starting to utilize artificial intelligence to thwart these kinds of threats. Now, AI, when it's configured correctly, is a pain. When it's configured poorly, it's a nightmare for the end user. So here's a tip. If the authentication is simple and secure enough for everyone, you really don't need the hassle of false positives and negatives that AI generates. Now, the employee enrollment process might be slightly different than the consumer registration. First and foremost, integration into an existing identity management or user provisioning tool is a must for employee authentication. Now, with the expansion of the remote workforce, the need for convenient and secure enrollment options is growing. Employees need the ability to register from home without the need to come into the office or contact the help desk or administrators. See, connecting to an organizational VPN should be easy without sacrificing security. Now, many organizations also have a need for more granular control. So you should have some sort of group registration that allows provisioning tools or administrators to send invitation links to groups of employees based on some unique rights and permissions. And from time to time, visitors, such as guests or vendors, are going to need limited or temporary access to corporate resources. So the ability to grant access on a temporary and time-restricted basis is going to help keep those organizational resources secure while providing the necessary access. Now, let's look at integrating passwordless authentication into the enterprise. With respect to enterprise integration, one thing you have to consider is where most of the workers will be working from, a Windows or a Mac OS desktop. The passwordless authentication tool should have native clients for both. This allows for the authentication to take place in case the mobile device is not available or is not allowed. Now, this also allows for integrating into the desktop unlock facility and support for native biometrics that are supported by those devices, and additional factors like YubiKey hardware tokens, which have become quite popular. Now, with the increasing incidence of COVID-related social engineering attacks and the growing remote workforce, the necessity of a secure connection to the workplace is growing. VPN usage is exploding. Now, the good news is they all support the Radius protocol. So the secure Radius protocol should be coupled with strong, at least two-factor or beyond, to protect against the unauthorized access to critical corporate data. Now, all while reducing the management effort and cutting those costs. Now, we know that SMS OTP is costly as well as insecure. So instead of manually entering a time-based code, the user should simply press a confirmation button to get signed in. Now, with the prevalence of third-party cloud applications, single sign-on is a must for many business entities. And with single sign-on, users authenticate only once to access multiple web apps. But the SSO tool's base implementation is to have one password, which is one too many. By acting as an identity provider, the passwordless authentication tool could sit right in front and perform the authentication first, and then let the SSO tool pass the user on to all the applications they're registered for. And of course, if there's not an SSO tool present, then your passwordless authentication tool should be able to support SSO. Now, some business environments are even more complex. You see, SSO is usually an outbound authentication initiated by an identity provider, but there may also be a need to support incoming authentication as a service provider for partners like suppliers, dealers, and such. Now, the authentication, this should be performed by the trusted partner, but you might want to trust but verify. Why not have those partners perform additional factors of authentication, which take less than a second and totally eliminate the risk of impersonation? All of the capabilities and techniques we've discussed so far really focus on simplicity. But we need to make that authentication more secure. So before we throw the baby out with the bathwater and replace passwords with tokens, we need to make sure this process is secure. Let's go back to the basics of multi-factor authentication. There are three types: something you know, something you have, and something you are. Now, using two methods, such as password and SMS OTP, and calling it MFA, are really only two of the first type, something you know. Well, guess what? Anytime a human knows something, another human can know it too. The most secure authentication will utilize all three types of authentication. Now, let's discuss the standard model of centralized authentication. You see, the password authentication model requires the secret to be kept in two places. The first is a central repository. The other is in the memory of a human. Now, the central password repository is synonymous with a bank vault in that you're keeping something valuable away from those with bad intentions. But why do criminals rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do hackers crack into password vaults? Because that's where the passwords are. Of course, banks are likely to invest more in the security of the money vault than they do in protecting the password vaults. But in spite of how diligent an organization is about securing the enterprise, there are just too many ways to get in: misconfiguration, compromised employees, etc. Now, humans, well, we're supposed to keep the password secret known only to us, but humans like to share secrets. Or worse yet, Humans can be tricked into giving up their password. Just send them a legitimate email that looks like it's from someone they do business with and ask them for that password. Okay, not everyone will fall for those phishing attacks, but you know what? A surprising number will. In one study, 43% of users fell for an email with the subject line, password check required. Now, when you consider that since humans choose their password so they can remember it, the sheer number of different passwords forces them to reuse that password. Now, that means that if a hacker phishes someone for a password, it's likely reused at other common sites. Same with the case where a password vault is breached. These passwords have likely been used at other sites. So, no matter how secure your password vault is, to eliminate fraud, you have to hope that other sites are as secure as yours and that all users use different strong passwords on every site. Good luck with that. Now, let's look at another trending method. Obviously, there's this push to go without passwords. And the most popular method is the use of tokens that are granted by either social networks or other services like Office 365. And essentially what you're doing is you ask the user to authenticate to their service and then prompt the user to grant the authenticator permission to use a secure token, which it's going to grant to the device being used. Now, this has to be repeated each time the user comes in from a different device or browser. It's not ideal, but hey, we got rid of the password, didn't we? Well, the issues go far beyond having to register each device or browser. We know that social accounts are easily taken over by hackers using fake websites or even some of the Microsoft services for that matter. And then all they do is ask them to provide their credentials. So the hackers can easily either create an account on behalf of a user or trick the user into logging in and granting that particular token. The problem here is that these tokens are one-way authentication. There's no verification that the service asking for the token once it's been granted is valid. So just like passwords, the user can be tricked into initiating the authentication. The hacker captures the token and then replays it to the real site for account takeover. You see, when passwordless experience is mistaken for passwordless security, everyone pays the price. We need to break that trend. First step in breaking the trend, decentralize the authentication. Okay? Move the tokens from a central server to the end user's device. Now this allows, by replacing the tokens, replacing the passwords with a token, this enables true passwordless security. And rather than storing the hundreds, thousands, or millions of passwords in a single repository, the user credentials are actually decentralized, stored safely in the advanced trusted environment on the user's personal devices. Now, this removes the hacker's primary target, which was the vault, and it renders the credential stuffing attacks infeasible. And shrinking your attack surface is never a bad idea, but let's not stop there. A term to become familiar with, full duplex authentication. Now, this is something that Identity has a trademark and a patent on, and we believe that it's essential to securing token-based authentication. You see, users providing their token credentials without checking the service provider's authenticity can lead to those credentials being intercepted and used to impersonate the actual user. So, before the user authenticates to the service, let's make sure that the service authenticates to the user using full duplex authentication, thereby essentially eliminating impersonation on either end. Now, decentralized authentication based on FIDO standards means that certificates in lieu of passwords that never leave the user's device and are never stored on a server. When you enhance this with full duplex authentication, well, you virtually eliminated the risk of phishing all forms of credential theft and replay attacks. Nothing for the user to share, and impersonation is off the table. These all come together to enable NIST Authenticator Assurance Level 3, right here, Level 3, which says must not be vulnerable to impersonation. Now, let's deconstruct multi-factor authentication as we know it and put it back together in a way that is simple and secure. You see, many authenticators strengthen the password process by just adding to it, but why not just eliminate the password? There's no need for it. You know, passwords are familiar, and Fernando's invention was groundbreaking, but so were Walkman's. Just because it was a good idea then doesn't mean we need it now. Let's get rid of all the headaches caused by passwords, thereby simplifying registration, authentication, and increasing security in one fell swoop. And don't just settle for token-based authentication. A lot of sites do this. It's just as easy to phish those users for the tokens as it is to steal a password. Now, most of today's multi-factor authentication solutions are still only using two factors, password plus something else. Let's use three-factor authentication, including the use of biometrics, which is arguably one of the stronger factors. Users can quickly and securely authenticate with zero typing actions by the user. And of course, we need to ditch the patently insecure SMS OTP and token-based authentication for full duplex push-based authentication. And you know, while we're at it, you can look at tying up some loose ends by adding some context-based authentication. You can bolster the strength by doing things like checking the device's proximity to configured areas, think geofencing, and you should never allow rooted or jailbroken devices to authenticate to your network. You see, we're conditioned to resist change. We generally like things the way they are, but with your help, we can ditch this password paradigm and solve a number of problems too. Now, some additional capabilities to consider. These are important if you want to take your user experience to the highest levels of satisfaction. Authentication at login is great. But there's also situations where the same full duplex authentication is useful for authorizing transactions. Banking is just one example. Now, when your customers or employees call in, wouldn't it be great to truly verify if they are who they say they are? Remembering a pen or a favorite teacher can be challenging. But if the customer service rep or help desk rep can initiate an authorization to the caller's personal device, they simply tap OK on their phone, you can be sure that they are who they say they are. And multi-factor authentication should be able to be performed by any kiosk or ATM for that matter. And then for many of you, you might, if you have a customer portal, you might also have your own mobile app. So it might make sense to take the passwordless capabilities and integrate them directly into your mobile app. You can really control the user experience that way. And then, of course, the SDK from the passwordless authentication tool should include features like using social login to login for consumers, geofencing, certificate provisioning, those kinds of things. All right, so first question. My organization is considering modifying our password policy change time from 90 days to 2 years. What risk should I be considering as it relates to this lengthy change time? Well, to be honest with you, password-based security, it really doesn't matter how often you change that particular password. The more times that you ask a user to change the password, the better chance you have of the user messing that process up or forgetting and getting hosed up in that change process. But think about this. All I have to do is ask you for your password. That's all I have to do to gain security if that's all that's protecting your enterprise. So however long you want to make your password, however often you want to change your password, the primary weakness is that it's one of the types of authentication that is something you know. If you do not put something beyond that, like something you have and something you are with a biometric, you're not going to be very secure. Good question, though. How do you propose getting biometrics to normal people? I think I know where you're going with that. Biometrics these days is actually something that is quite comfortable for the majority of folks that have a smartphone. Maybe they don't realize they're executing the biometric because the manufacturers have made this a natural part of the process. But even without biometrics, using pattern matching or using pens, just additional factors with those devices can make things a heck of a lot more secure. The fact that that has to be done from a mobile device as opposed to just relying on the base password can make your organization more secure. But great question. Okay, what about regular computers, not just phones? With the biometrics, understand the question. So biometrics haven't quite made their way to all the personal computing devices. So that may be a bit of a challenge, putting fingerprint readers or things like that. But one thing I will recommend is that you add things like YubiKeys, which are hardware tokens that require an activation key, that an activation button per se. That action alone adds another element or another factor of authentication of something you have that can increase your security. So you don't necessarily have to, if biometrics are a big deal, and not all biometrics work, by the way. The facial recognition was great until the pandemic hit. Now we've all got masks on, right? So there needs to be alternate methods, pens and pattern swiping and that sort of thing for that type of security. But anyway, so we're out of, let's see here. Okay, we're out of time. I want to thank you guys for listening. Please be sure to take a look at our website and follow us on LinkedIn. The LinkedIn has a lot of great articles that we post from time to time that really help keep security professionals informed on the latest and greatest threats. So I want to thank you all for listening. I want everyone to have a great evening. Be safe and be well. Thank you.